Turns out mutations are actually a problem for evolution because of the false prediction that was made about them. I'm here with Dr. Cornelius Hunter, and today we're going to be talking about one of the many false predictions that evolutionists have made and give you more reasons to be confident that evolution is false. It's an absurd theory, and we want to show you why. So welcome, Dr. Hunter. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'm really looking forward to this discussion about false prediction number 3. And that one is that mutations are non-adaptive. So a very interesting prediction that turned out to be false. Now, I refer to these predictions, and there's a couple dozen of them. I refer to these as fundamental. So they're not tangential. We're not looking at tangential figures. These are fundamental in evolutionary thought, well documented. Well, this one is the fundamentalist fundamental one. This is right up there with the most fundamental of these predictions. It's really a hill to die on for evolutionists. And you're going to learn a lot about evolution. If you understand this one, you'll understand evolution. Most people don't understand evolution. So I need to start out with some clarifications, just some quick clarifications, just so we are understanding what is meant by this prediction. And then I want to ask everyone a question. So I want you to be thinking about this question. And the question is, why? Why is this a prediction of evolution? Because if you look at the theory of evolution, it isn't clear, it doesn't seem like this prediction, that is, mutations are non-adaptive. Why would that be a prediction of evolution? So I'll ask that question, and of course I'll answer it, but be thinking about that. So to start out with some quick clarifications, when evolutionists say mutations are non-adaptive, and by the way, sometimes they'll say they must be random. So mutations are random or they're non-adaptive. They don't mean that mutations can never be adaptive. There's no such thing, never, ever adaptive. Yes, they are adaptive sometimes. The prediction is they can only be adaptive by chance. So if you have thousands and thousands and thousands of mutations happening, most of them will be harmful or neutral. Maybe once in a while you get lucky and you get a good one. That would be a positive, a mutation that increases the fitness of the individual. And to put it in evolutionary terms, increasing the fitness.
But the key is they can't be intentional, right? Like they can't.
Yes, intentional or directed or repeatable. So if you expose a population to a environmental stress, something changes in the environment, the nutrition, the temperature, or whatever. It can't just repeatedly create this mutation that responds, it helps with that. In short order, within a generation or two, you just get, oh, this mutation appears, and it can't appear in multiple individuals. So if you did an experiment like with plants and you expose them to a temperature shift that has stressed them, you're not going to see 3/4 of the plant for the next generation of plants. 3/4 of them have this have this identical mutation that helps with that environmental stress. And then you do it again. You do the experiment all over again, and you get the same result. And you do it again, you get the same result. That's what cannot happen for this. This prediction says that cannot happen. Repeatable, directed, and so forth. Now, I also mentioned the word random. Sometimes you'll hear it, mutations must be random. The prediction is not that mutations must always everywhere be random. They can be non-random with respect to time, with respect to space, with respect to the genome. Maybe some chromosomes have more mutations for some reason. These are all trends in mutations that are perfectly fine with evolutionists. What they can't be is non-random with respect to need. So that's the key. and that's adaptive, right? So you have a need, you have some sort of environmental stressor, something has changed, and then you have a mutation that responds to that. That would be non-random in the way that evolution cannot tolerate. It cannot. It can be non-random, but can't be with respect to need. So you'll hear that. They must be random. Just don't take that too literally. And they must be non-adaptive in general, non-responsive, not directed. Okay, those are the clarifications. Now the question
Now, can
is,
you explain a little bit more, though, what you mean by adaptive? You mean like not specifically helping the organism to adapt to their environment, like natural selection will select for what is the best for being adaptive, but the mutations themselves can't be directed toward helping the organism. Is that right?
yeah, but specifically in addressing the current environmental stress. So whatever that is, something's going. There's a drought. There's climate change. A volcano went off. There was an earthquake. There's a new predator in the environment. Something has changed. You cannot have a mutation suddenly arrive that is directly helping with that stressor, unless it's by chance. It's just, once in a billion years, that's going to happen by chance. So I'll explain that a little bit more when I get into this question. Now I want to ask this question: why? Why is this a prediction of evolution? Because if you think about it, what is evolutionary theory? The species evolved according to a variety of natural mechanisms. Obviously, mutations is the main one. And then you have gradualism, you have common descent, you have punctuated equilibrium. You have all kinds of explanatory mechanisms to explain how the species evolved. Why would adaptive mutations be ruled out? Why can't you have, you have mutations and they're being selected for. Okay, why can't you have adaptive ones? In principle, it would seem that would be perfectly fine. And this insistence by evolutionists that you can't have that, we need to look at that. We need to think about that. In fact, Charles Hodge at Princeton in the 1800s, a couple decades after Darwin, wrote this book, What is Darwinism? So that was one of the early critiques of evolution, and he didn't get it. So he made that same question of, Darwin seems to be doing mental gymnastics to rule out God, to get away from any divine intention here. Why is he doing this? It must be atheism. So this is atheism. And so I don't think that's true. And to his credit, the scholarship on evolutionary thought had not come to the place to really support it. It was hard to figure it out. It's a hard problem. We're in a better place today. But he said, well, this must be atheism. Well, no, it's not. And I'm going to explain why here. I'm going to explain why this is a prediction of evolution. So I'm going to answer the question that I ask, why? Why is this a prediction of evolution? Imagine two cases. Both have it's the same population, same organism, same species, and you have an environmental stress. Something happens. Temperatures change, whatever. Predator, something happens. Now I'm going to give you two different scenarios of how the population responds. In both cases, they adapt. In both cases, they survive, they evolve. In one case, you have random mutations happening, these non-adaptive mutations, and it's tough. The population is struggling with this new stress. But over time, eventually, you do luck out and you get a mutation that helps. And then maybe you get another one. And they build up and say, they respond. And so they are selected for the ones that help. Those individuals have more children. And so it propagates through the population. It gets selected for. That's natural selection. So that's in that scenario, you have random mutations, non-adaptive mutations, and you have natural selection. Okay. The other scenario, same sort of deal, except in this case, you have in the very first generation right away, you have a responsive, a directed mutation occurring. What appears to be, you have this mutation that occurs that really helps against this threat. And it's not just one individual. It's maybe 3/4 or half or some large fraction of the population suddenly has this mutation and they're doing better right away. Maybe there's a couple of mutations, but it helps. And they're doing much better than the first case. So what about those two scenarios? What's wrong with the second scenario? Why would that be ruled out? Well, the reason is it implies, it smacks of design. It smacks of what philosophers call final causes or teleology, because the environment is sending a message into the individual. And so here's a message, and I'm going to trigger this I'm going to activate some pathways, and then the individual is going to realize, oh, this is a heating problem, this is a predator problem, and let's engage a couple of mutations here. Let's change the design, change our set point, modify our design. That smacks of intention. It smacks of design. There's no, August Weismann was a German evolutionist after Darwin, a couple of generations after Darwin, and he was very concerned about this problem, and he formalized evolutionary theory. And he said, he formalized some of these concepts about surrounding evolutionary theory. And he said, there's got to be a barrier between the environment and the germ cells. So in any individual, you have the germ cells, you have the somatic cells. The germ cells are the sex cells, and you have the somatic cells, which is the rest of the body. The information can only flow one way. So the germ cells create the body. When you have a zygote, you have the first initial individual. It's created from the sperm and the egg. The sex cells get together, make this zygote. Then that builds out the individual. So it's the information is flowing from the sex cells to the somatic cells. You cannot have it going in the opposite direction. You cannot have the somatic cells modifying the sex cells. And that's what's called the Weismann barrier. So this is right around the turn of the century, 1900, right around that time frame, that he devised that. And that became a very strong principle in evolutionary theory, strong doctrine, the Weismann barrier. You cannot have that. And he said, we can't have that, because if we do, it's going to look like a directive force. It's going to look like a supernatural intrusive force. To have organisms be able to do that, they must have been designed to be able to pick up these signals and make these changes. So we can't allow that. Now you say, well, was Weismann an atheist? Well, I actually don't know what his personal belief was, but his idea was, no, we're protecting God against being the creator of this world. And this goes back to the Epicureans. I won't go through the whole story, but just briefly, if you say that God created, teeth for chewing, you also have to say he created the possibility of toothaches and all the other things we don't like about the world. So if God is too close, if he's too responsible for the things we like, then he's also responsible for the things that we don't like. And so they need to protect God, get him away from this bad world. The good God needs to be separated from this bad world. So it's not atheism, it's theism. It's protecting God against the world. So of course, that's not biblical, but it is not non-theism. So it is a theistic concern that people have. So we have this Weismann barrier, and this is why this is such a powerful, fundamental hill to die on prediction for evolution, is because evolution is motivated by these religious concerns. And this one, it gets right to the core. So if you understand that this having adaptive mutations just really cuts into this metaphysic, this underlying idea that God cannot be designed, this world cannot be the intention of God, that he went in there and he designed all the details. This smacks too much of, yeah, he did that. He designed this. He created this. It violates this principle of the world has to kind of operate on its own. So that first scenario I laid out, that's much more of the world is rumbling along on its own. And the changes that occur just simply occur naturally, accidentally, by chance. You happen to have these mutations occur. Oh, I got, like, after 1,000 mutations, I got a good one. Yeah, we had to endure 1,000 years of pain through this stressful environment. We finally got a good one. That's the way it goes. And then natural selection said, okay, this guy has more progeny, so that's going to take over the population, and then you're going to have adjustment of the population. But it takes a long time, and it starts with one mutation in one individual, slowly mutating, slowly propagating throughout the population. So that's a much more conducive story to the Epicureanism that is at the base of all of this. You can't have it smacking of design. So this prediction, just the prediction itself, forget about how it was falsified or anything else about it. If you understand just the reason that this is a prediction, a fundamental, perhaps the most fundamental prediction of evolution, then you realize you're going to understand what evolution is. Because why, as I said earlier, why should this be a prediction? Why should this be a prediction of evolution?
Well, yeah, you've really opened my mind to this, because I tend to think of evolution as an attempt to get God out of the picture, like to basically not have a God. But you've kind of shown me that like the history of it is actually much more about trying to explain why the world looks this way with a God, like,
exactly.
and trying to solve the problem of evil and that kind of thing. But do you think now it's more about like getting rid of God completely, or not really?
No, it is no different. So atheism, as you know, is a minor player. It's a bit player. It has always been a bit player. It's not a driver. Nobody, goes to war. Nobody prays. Nobody does because of atheism. It's theism that's the power. Theism has all the power. And today, what's going on? Christians are promoting and propagating and arguing fiercely for evolution. They are in the lineage of the Christians back before Darwin and during Darwin. The Christians have always forcefully argued to get God away from the world, and for this reason, to protect God. Now, again, there's a dozen different actual theological doctrines or theological traditions at work here. So it's not as simple as one thing. There's a bunch of things going on. But you can trace it back to antiquity with the Epicureans, and then you get, in modern times, Christians really elaborated and developed this. And so it's no different today. Now, it is true, yes, the success of evolution has spurred on atheism. So yeah, you do have atheism today. Maybe it's more than it was 100, 200 years ago. But even then, you look at the Richard Dawkins and those guys, they're using arguments from the Christians.
Right. They're using religious arguments. Okay,
Yeah.
we're kind of getting off our topic. So, but the point is mutations.
But we're actually not. And I
Okay.
get your point. Let's not go too far on this, but it's really key that when you look at these false predictions, they open up so much information about evolution, and they tell you so much. It's a great framework for learning about evolution. And in this case, it's just understanding the prediction itself. Why is this a prediction of evolution? Aha. It's because it is anti-teleology. It is anti-final causes. It's fundamentally Epicureanism. And so you have to have, the Epicureans, what was their mode of change? How did the world arise according to the Epicureans? Randomly swerving atoms. Random. Key word. And so the specific false prediction is mutations are non-adaptive. Mutations are non-adaptive. You cannot be responsive to environmental threats. You have an environmental threat that something changes the environment. You can't just have a mutation occur that responds to that threat. Mutations can only occur over time by luck. Many generations, thousands of years. Oh, I finally got lucky. That's the way it has to work for evolution. So the prediction that evolution is making is mutations are non-adaptive. They are random with respect to need. That's the prediction. And if they don't have that, it violates the metaphysic. It violates this Epicureanism that the world must be kind of rumbling along by itself. So the Epicureans said random motion. The evolutionists said random mutations. Same idea. It's got to be by random with respect to need. Okay, so that is the prediction. Mutations must be non-adaptive. It's not because of the core theory of evolution. So I don't
And
say
where was
actually,
that prediction made? Like, do we have sources of like people saying like this is fundamental to evolution?
Yeah, we do. And you can look at my write-up for some detailed quotes, but I'll give some right now. It was very, very fundamental. One was Sir Ronald Fisher, one was Sir Julian Huxley, one was Jacques Monod. Who are those guys? Well, those guys are the elites. They're the leading figures in 20th century evolutionary theorizing, right? Sir Ronald Fisher was a statistician, mathematician who developed a lot of the math underlying, well, even modern statistics, but especially the statistics as applied to population theory. Sir Julian Huxley, he was the grandson of Thomas Huxley, who was Darwin's bulldog, right? A friend of Darwin's, younger guy who really argued forcefully for Darwin's theory. So that was Thomas Huxley. His grandson was Julian Huxley. So you got a lineage there. And he wrote this book, Evolution in Action. And in this book, he says, mutation merely provides the raw material of evolution. It is a random affair and takes place in all directions. In all cases, they are random in relation to evolution. What he means they're random in relation to need, to fitness. Their effects are not related to the needs of the organisms, end quote. So you want an example? There's an example. Let me give you one from Jacques Monod. Jacques Monod, Nobel laureate, French guy, French biologist, and microbiologist, molecular biologist. There's his book, Chance and Necessity. And in that book, he elaborates on this, it's got to be by chance only. You can't have directed mutations. And so here's a quote that's just a classic quote. Chance alone is at the source of every innovation of all creation in the biosphere. Pure chance, absolutely free but blind, at the very root of the stupendous edifice of evolution. This central concept of modern biology is no longer one among other possible or even conceivable hypotheses. The only one that squares with observed and tested fact, and nothing warrants the supposition or the hope that on this score our position is likely ever to be revised. Okay, that was 1971. In a few short years, that was false. What he said would never be revised. So yeah, this is and you can find all kinds of other quotes in the literature, in peer-reviewed journals. Richard Lenski, Michigan State University, evolutionists, same sort of thing. Jerry Cohn, very strong on that, maintains that up to this day. In his blog, he writes on this every once in a while. Oh yeah, there's no question about it. Mutations are non-adaptive. So yeah, this is fundamental, real fundamental in evolutionary theory. Starting with Weismann and the Weismann barrier, or it doesn't start with Weismann, but that's a good formalization of this idea. You can't have the backward flow of information. Francis Crick had kind of a similar idea that kind of mirrors the parallels the Weismann barrier, which is the central dogma, what he called the central dogma. Of course, Crick was the Nobel laureate. He co-founded the structure of the DNA. And so he called it the central dogma, which was, now that we know DNA, he said information flows from the DNA to RNA, to the proteins, to the body. It cannot go the other way. You cannot have information flowing into the DNA. It's a one-way trip. And the only way you build up DNA is with these mutations. So we don't call that information. That's just random mutations. So the actual information, once you build up these genes, then it only flows out.
Well, but are they still saying that? Because I mean, don't they say that? I mean, we just had the ERV talk recently, and they think that all these viruses invaded and brought all this like functionality, vital functionality to organisms. So
yes, exactly. So you're getting into the falsification now, which is the next step.
okay.
So you exactly hit it. That's a great example. How do retroviruses, not all viruses inject into the DNA, but retroviruses do. Retroviruses inject their genome into the DNA. How do they do that? Well, they do it with an incredible machine, which was discovered after the Crick, promoted this central dogma in the centuries, decades later. This fantastic machine is called reverse transcriptase. It's an incredible protein machine which takes RNA, or takes genetic material and creates DNA and injects the DNA or integrates the DNA into the genome. A violation, a falsification, an empirical falsification, no question about it, of the central dogma. So yeah, it does go the other way. That central dogma lasted a few decades until that was falsified. So
can you explain to me, because I'm clear on why like it has to be, like non-directed, but I'm unclear about why it would need to be that way for evolution and not go the other direction. Like, do you know what I mean?
well,
Like, why is that violation of the central dogma? Why is that problematic for evolution?
Yeah, so the reason why it's you're exactly right that here in the 21st century, it's a little bit difficult to see this because there's so many layers on top of this. But you go back to earlier years, it was so clear that would smack of design. That you cannot have organisms, biological designs that are so smart, that are so adaptive. I call it intelligent adaptation. So when you expose a population to a stress, an environmental stressor, you get intelligent adaptation. Intelligent meaning it adapts quickly. It happens in multiple individuals within a generation or two, and all of a sudden the population is happy. It's adjusted to this environmental threat. That is so antithetical to the anti-teleology. It smacks of teleology, it smacks of design, it smacks of final causes. Now, I'm going to talk about a response that evolutionists make. So we're going to get to the outcomes that'll help answer your question. So we have this prediction, mutations must be non-adaptive. What happened with that? And I gave some quotes. So there were early hints, actually, going back to the early 20th century, 100 years ago, practically, early hints that this may not be quite working. And even if you don't call them mutations, even if you're just talking about the Weismann barrier and the information flow, but the hints that this was something more complicated than that. So there have been severe debates about this, but the evolution modern synthesis side won out. And the idea that the Epicurean side won out big time. So most people would never hear about these debates. They have no idea that they happened. They learned in high school biology class, the Epicurean version of evolution. And so that dominated, utterly dominated 20th century. But there were early hints. And then toward the end of the 20th century, about 30 years ago, 40 years ago, the hints started to grow. And one of the hints was when you expose, let's say, a population of bacteria, it's simple, easy to work with. You take E. coli and you subject it to a stress. The mutation rates sometimes will increase. So you subjected it to a stress, and all of a sudden you got higher mutation rate. And then there will be a subset of individuals in the population that are called hypermutators. They increase even more. So what's going on there? That looks very designed. You have a subset of individuals that somehow know they are somehow selected to crank it up. So they're searching through the design space. They're searching for changes that will help. And so there's an early
intentional mutations, organisms intentionally mutating to try to adapt to the environment.
But they're still undirected because it's not specific mutations to help with that threat. It's simply increasing the search rate, amping up the rate of mutations. So that provided evolutionists with something to argue against. So no, that's not adaptive. So they started adjusting their position to try and they handled those. Another early hint was actually certain areas of the genome would get mutations that would include mutations that helped. So you would be responsive, but the responsive wasn't precise. It wasn't, this specific mutation popped up. It was this area, you got a better chance of that mutation popping up. See, so it's kind of a gray area. It's not exactly falsifying the prediction, but it's certainly challenging it. You're getting these early hints. So you had that, but those were just the beginning. At this point, there's too many examples of specific mutations, repeatable. I'll give you one example: flax plants in the 2000s. You expose a population of flax plants to a change in the fertilizer levels, the nutrition levels in the soil, or the temperature levels, whatever. You stress them out, and you get a mutation. In one case, it was an insertion into the genome, and it happened in multiple individuals, and it happened quickly within a generation. And then you do it again. You do the whole experiment again with a different set of plants, flax plants, the same species, but different individuals, get the same thing. Then you do it again, get the same thing. Remember what I said a few minutes ago?
So it seems to be directed. It seems like there's, yes.
Remember what I said at the beginning? The one thing they cannot tolerate, you can adjust your position a little bit. The evolutionists can adjust a little bit and say, no, that those hot spots and the raising the mutation rate, that doesn't count. This prediction is still solid. But the one thing they can't tolerate is repeatability, multiple individuals with repeatability. The same thing happens over and over again in some large fraction of the individuals in the population. You redo the experiment, you get the same thing. That we couldn't tolerate. Well, that's exactly what happened. So this clearly was falsified. And you still know, okay, so you can read more about it. Arlen Stoltzfus is a biologist who has written extensively about this whole question of mutation. And he said, quote, "This prediction has been breaking down from the moment it was proposed." So he's going back to those early debates, and he's saying, this was never really a strong prediction or empirically supported, never supported very well empirically. And now it's really obvious. So it just has failed. The prediction it was well documented, fundamental prediction, no question about it, clearly stated, leading evolutionists, not tangential, clearly failed, no question about it. But what's interesting and what really helps about this to know is to understand why was it a prediction in the first place? Because it does not naturally flow from evolutionary theory. So I actually don't say this was a prediction of evolutionary theory. I say it was a prediction of evolutionary thought, right? Because it doesn't flow from the theory, it flows from the underlying theology, and that's evolutionary thought. The Epicurean. you have to get God away. You can't have this directed mutation that smacks of design, smacks of final causes.
Now, what has been the response to this? Since all of these people were saying this was fundamental, you can't have directed mutations, and now we've observed directed mutations. What is the response?
Perfect segue. That was my next topic, was the outcomes. So in each of these false predictions that I write about, I go through 3 steps: the false prediction itself, the falsification of it, and the outcome, or denouement, what happened. So what happened here? We've got all this evidence. Well, I categorize the response into 3 categories: denial, obfuscation, and doubling down. Those are the 3 sorts of responses I see. And I've been personally, subjected to a lot of these. So in my debates, I debated, or had a panel discussion / debate at Cornell University back in 2006 with a couple of professors there, Richard Harrison, who was the head of the chair of the biology department, and Kern Reeve. And this is one of the things I brought up, was I brought up a whole bunch of false predictions. And one of them was, mutations are non-adaptive. So Rick just waved it off. No, doesn't matter. No, that's a fallacy. No. And that happened to me at a San Jose State debate that I had as well. Same thing, just wave it off. Doesn't matter. No, he doesn't know what he's talking about. Just total denial, not even dealing with it. And he then responded to some, he grabbed on to some of those early hints. Said, oh yeah, there was some work done, a couple decades ago. Some interesting work, but it never went anywhere. It doesn't indicate that mutations are non-adaptive. It just, there's a general, increase in the rate, or what I described a few minutes ago. So he kind of latched on and used those examples as fodder for denying this. And I said, well, no, the work has gone beyond that. And I said, there's whole books written on this. I remember I said that specifically because there are. And I should never have said that. It's a great setup. Rick said, yeah, there's whole books written on all kinds of false ideas. And of course, he's right, So books written on things doesn't prove anything. But today, I was pointing in the right direction there. Today, it's no question, So I was keying on findings that were recent findings that were indicating this. Now, so that's kind of the denial. Then there's the obfuscation, where latching on to these confusions, like I talked about the random confusion. We don't say they're not random. They can be non-random with respect to space or with respect to time. So you're mischaracterizing it. So you can have those sorts of canards, responding to straw man arguments, or latching onto these early hints that they have now adjusted to, and say, no, that just because they raise their mutation rates, or just because there's hotspots, they weren't actually specific mutations, so that doesn't do the job. And so you get that kind of response. And Jerry Cohen does that sort of thing on his blogs. And then the third one is doubling down. And this is the one kind of gets to your question earlier, which was, well, why exactly is this a problem? Because this doubling down is going to make it a non-problem. And it's going to make it seem like, oh, okay, that's just the way biology works. And so what this idea is, yeah, there are directed mutations. Okay, that's true. We can't deny that anymore. But they are enabled by systems that do that. So there is in our cells, there are adaptation mechanisms, adaptation systems that do that. And those adaptation systems evolved by random mutation. So we don't fully understand these systems yet, but they evolved by random mutation. So, 100 years ago, they had no concept of the complexity of biology that we have today. Today, we're subjected to orders of magnitude more complexity. on a practically weekly basis, there's another journal paper coming out just blowing our minds with incredible things that biological designs do. And so it's becoming more commonplace where we are numb to it, and we're seeing it as, oh, that's just a product of evolution. And so everything we see now, so evolutionists refused this, they denied this, they fought it, this idea of adaptive mutations, and now they're incorporating it. So it's a huge pivot, a 180 pivot. It's like, oh, well, that's just evolutionary theory. That's what we do. Yeah, we do adaptive mutations, but it all comes from random mutations. Random mutations created this world. And so now we're in a situation where it's kind of like your question a few minutes ago, Rebekah, which is, well, what's the problem with this again? And that's what people are, that your typical evolutionists say, well, it's not a big deal. So this was all created by evolution. So David Haig, Harvard professor in 2007, had a paper entitled Weismann Rules. And in that paper, he said, yeah, systems of adaptive directed mutation, purposefulness, apparent purposefulness, originated by random mutations and natural selection. That's the way we understand this. That's the way we model this. So evolution is the cause of causes, as Darwin's grandfather put it, Erasmus Darwin. Oh, how wonderful it would be if evolution is the cause of causes. Well, we got exactly what Erasmus was talking about. Now, there's a lot of problems with that doubling down idea. And this is one of the general outcomes of all these false predictions is increased complexity. So the theory becomes way more complex. So originally it was a nice, simple, elegant theory that Darwin put together. And now it's this like the tax code. And that's the death knell in science. You cannot have theory complexity. It is an absolute failure. And now in the age of big data, we know this better than ever before, although it goes way back to Occam's razor in the Middle Ages. But we now know it in a very practical way. You cannot have theory complexity. It kills you. It kills theories. It's very serious. It's a very serious problem. So you cannot simply be adding on epicycle after epicycle after epicycle. And that's what this is. This is just a stupid, non-empirical, no evidence for this epicycle that's added on. So that's the problem right off the bat, is just the theory complexity. Secondly, it's actually not possible under evolutionary theory, if you think about it. And what do I mean by that? If you have somehow random mutations creating this complexity, let's just say, okay, let's set that aside. It got lucky. Let's allow for that for the purposes of argument. You have this incredible complexity. It wouldn't be selected for. And why is that? Because the complexity, this adaptive system, the system that's going to create adaptive mutations when there's some future environmental threat. Well, the environmental threat is just that. It's in the future. It's not now. And what is selection? Selection is now. It has to be now. The only thing that works with selection is now. If you have a design that's going to work in 1,000 years, that's going to be not selected for. It will not survive the vagaries of time. So the whole idea of this is not, it doesn't work according to evolutionary theory. Now, Andres Wagner, a theoretician, has talked about this. He calls it secondary selection or indirect selection, second order selection or indirect selection. And he's trying to wrangle a way to find how we can make sense out of that. But again, you're adding these layers and layers of complexity and abstraction to the theory that make no sense. It wouldn't be selected for. So there's that problem. And then it's self-referential. You have evolution creating evolution. So evolution creates these mechanisms that create adaptive mutations that are going to create further evolution. Evolution creates evolution. So there's all kinds of serendipity and complexity and problems with this idea. But that's what you see coming out when you judge how a theory responds to a false prediction. If there's new knowledge that's discovered, wonderful. If there's a smoking gun involved, wonderful. You discovered a new planet because you had this false prediction. That's what happened in astronomy. Wonderful. That's a good false prediction. When you have ad hoc explanations, when you have additional complexity and serendipity and impossible conflicting with other elements of the theory, and as in this case, that you have to have something selected for, even though it doesn't improve fitness. All of those things are bad signs. Those are signs of a dying theory, of a decaying theory, of a theory that isn't working. And it's being clung to by, it's a sad sign of scientists, evolutionists struggling and not following the data, not following the evidence, but doing theory protectionism. So that's the false prediction number 3. What do we got here?
Okay, so I'm gonna do this because sometimes there's like a gap between, there's like a lot of complicated concepts that you're explaining. And Dr. Dan is an evolutionary biologist. He says, do you understand the argument he's making? To me, maybe you could paraphrase it for the rest of us. I think we're all confused. Okay, so here's the argument broken down. You can correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Hunter, but this is what I understand. Evolution needs things to be happening by natural, undirected processes, right? And so the main driver of evolution, the drivers, I would say, mutation and natural selection are supposed to be driving evolution. But natural selection can only select from what's already present. Mutation is the originator. And what is predicted in evolution is that mutations are by chance. There's not a specific, there's no, mutations aren't happening by some sort of purpose or direction. They are not willing the organism in a certain direction. They're just happening, right? And so this is supposed to be random mutations that, somehow the ones that are positive are then being selected. And so that's a fundamental prediction of evolution, is that this is not happening. Evolution is not happening in a directed way. But what has actually turned out to be true is that mutations do seem to be happening in a directed way. And so that is a contradiction of evolution's prediction. It's a contradiction. It's saying that, look, and the way that some of the things that Dr. Hunter expressed, how are we seeing that mutations are actually directed? We're seeing in bacteria, when they encounter a stressor, they have mechanisms that kick in that increase mutations. And so it's as if the mutations are a response to a stressor. And then you also have, and hold on, I'm losing my train of thought, but you also have repeatable mutations. So for example, you had experiments such as in Lenski's experiment. I don't know if you specifically mentioned that experiment. You just mentioned more specific, like more generally. But we have experiments where we have exposed bacteria to repeated stressors, and they always respond in this. Well, we can repeatedly show that they respond in the same way, and with certain mutations. So that shows that this isn't just happening by random. It's something that is like an actual response. So am I characterizing this correctly?
Yeah, that was good. I mean, there's a few details I would like to add. One is that it was flax plants. That is a good example from 2005 and 2009 papers. I think it was Oregon State University, but I can't remember for sure. But flax plants that showed that repeatable mutation in multiple individuals, in multiple experiments that were run. So that was a good example of what looked very much like a directed mutation. It would be hard to believe that this was all just by luck, and over again, you got the same, just happened to get the same mutation occurring. So that was a good example. The bacteria example that you mentioned of raising the mutation rate and then having the hot spot, having the super hypermutators, that's an early hint. And so evolutionists could respond to that and say, no, that doesn't quite falsify our, it's not quite specific enough. That doesn't, sorry, that one doesn't work. Go back, try again. So that was an early hint that could be rejected. Yeah, we get another.
Are you familiar with this experiment? Because this was brought up toward the beginning, but it's being brought up again now by Dr. Thompson. And so there's another comment I can find that has a little description of it, but are you already familiar with this?
I am, but I can't really regurgitate the details live very well. But yeah, I have totally read and understand the experiment, and it's another good, very interesting example. But I think I'm going to have to hold off on intelligent commentary on it. It's just not something that's on the tip of my tongue. But
okay,
the other thing that's Dr. Dan, that question that he asked, Professor Dan, I'm not sure if he meant that to be intended for the entire false prediction or for the doubling down. So let me just answer both very, very briefly. For the entire thing, keep in mind what's interesting is this prediction, the prediction that mutations must be non-adaptive, is not required by the core evolutionary theory. And by core, what I'm meaning here is just the science. You just strip away any metaphysical thought. If you just look at the idea that species arose by natural means, unless you're pouring a lot of metaphysics into that word natural, but if you're stripping out the metaphysics, it's just there's no apparent reason why you cannot tolerate adaptive mutations. Why not? Well, when you think about it for 5 seconds, you quickly realize, because that is metaphysically laden. It implies design. It implies teleology. It implies final causes. And this is all abundantly obvious in the writings, but from Weissman all the way back to the Epicureans. They cannot tolerate that. So this is a case where a scientific hypothesis is clearly interfacing with and overlapping with metaphysics and religion. And so it does this a lot in evolutionary theory. I point this out a lot, but here's a good one. This is a good instance where, there's a real strong interface here. There's implications.
Okay, now that brings me to asking then, so you said it's not actually a problem for evolutionary theory. It's only the problem when you bring in the metaphysical things associated with evolutionary theory.
Would
this not be a problem? Like what I'm saying is like if we could take away the metaphysical thoughts, is this I'm trying to say I don't know what I'm trying to say. I'm just trying to figure out
I get your point. Let me elaborate on it. Is there a way to rescue evolution?
Yes.
Can we come up with an evolutionary? What about all the biologos crowd and all the Christians pushing evolution? Do they have something? Is there something they can come up with where you have you allow for divine action as part of your theory? So this gets into a very tricky discussion. First of all, the biologos crowd would never allow for that because they are evolutionists. They don't want that. That they are the ones who are behind evolution. They're like the Christians, the Lutherans, and the Anglicans of the 17th century and 18th century. They're like the Epicureans. They don't want that because they're protecting God. So they do not want that. They're not going to. They're the ones who do not want mutations to be adaptive. So this is the confusion that Charles Hodge had. He didn't get that. He said, "Why are you doing these mental gymnastics to keep teleology out of the picture?" Because that's the whole point. That was the foundation of evolutionary thought. He didn't understand that. It is Epicureanism. warmed over Epicureanism, a modern version of Epicureanism. So you cannot tolerate that. So is there can you rescue evolution? Is there a version that could be acceptable? Probably probably is a way to do that, but it wouldn't be acceptable. And so Hodge didn't get it. B.B. Warfield also didn't get it. For those in the audience who know the Princeton years after Hodge was B.B. Warfield. B.B. Warfield, and these are all Reformed thinkers. B.B. Warfield said, "I'm an evolutionist. I'm a pure evolutionist." Well, no, he wasn't. What he allowed for was, he said, "I don't mind if God uses secondary causes to create the species, and so evolution is fine, so long as God can intervene when he feels like it, and he can go in there and inject designs and inject species and so forth." Well, he just violated the whole foundation of evolutionary theory. So he wasn't an evolutionist. So he didn't understand what evolution is, and Hodge didn't get it. So that's just as a side there. But that's why this is a very good prediction of evolution, because there's no question it is a prediction. It's fundamental. It's a hill to die on. It's one of the most fundamental predictions there is. And yet, why? Why would it be a prediction? Why should they say that? It's not apparent that would be that does not naturally derive from the idea that the species arose naturally. So why not have mutations that are adaptive? Well, that's not natural according to evolution. That violates the whole naturalism thing. It smacks of design. So just the prediction alone, forget about whether it was falsified or not. Just the prediction alone opens the kimono. All of a sudden, it shows in full color what evolution is. Evolution is metaphysical, and they can't hide this. I mean, this is all the leading evolutionists pounding this home. Even today, Jerry Cohen pounding this home. It must be non-adaptive. Must be. There's no reason for that unless you are an Epicurean, unless you are beholden to Epicureanism, to this metaphysics where God has to be separated. Epicureans were not atheists. You'll often hear, "Oh, well, those Greeks, those guys are atheists." No, they weren't. They were not atheists. They believed in gods, but they knew that they had to separate them from the world. They had to be off on a distant Mount Olympus, safely insulated from the world, meditating on a distant Mount Olympus. That the whole problem is when you get God in the world, the doctrine of immanence. That's the problem, or divine intent, that God intended for this world. That cannot be, and that's the whole history of evolutionary thought. So this prediction is wonderful in exposing that a tenet that they just took for granted, and they didn't mind shouting from the rooftops. But if you actually think about it for 5 seconds, you realize, oh, this is all metaphysics. This prediction itself, forget about whether it was falsified or not, just making the prediction so forcefully, so fundamentally, that's metaphysics. This is not science. This is religion. Now, on to the doubling down outcome. Oh, random mutations just made all that. First of all, it's super complicated. These systems are not, you can't have 1 or 2 mutations to create this. So it's a ridiculous idea that this could happen by random mutations. But setting that problem aside, if you did somehow luckily create an adaptive system with apparent purposefulness, it wouldn't be selected for, because it's not increasing the fitness. This is not a fitness increasing system until and unless that future environmental threat transpires. It has to happen. You have to have that disaster happen. Then it becomes selectable. Then it is fitness increasing. That might be 1,000 years from now. And how are you going to anticipate all the different environmental threats? So it's not just one environmental threat, right? I mean, there's a whole bunch, there's a whole range, a whole spectrum of potential environmental threats. You have to program those into some sort of systems. via random mutations. This defies credibility. This is stupid. It is such a non-scientific, non-empirical, non-reasonable hypothesis. Way too complicated and not selectable in the first place. And then you have the referential problem. Evolution is creating evolution. So if that isn't clear to Professor Dan, the evolution professor, then there's a problem, because this is a very obvious false prediction that reveals so much.
Okay, I'm going to bring up some other comments, and you may have already really responded to this, but Dr. Dan says we have not observed directed mutations.
Bingo. Love it. Love it. That's the denial one. So that goes back to denial. No such thing. Never observed it. Those flax experiments, but they don't count. Well, why don't they count? I don't know. They just don't count because they violate evolution. In other words, they violate the metaphysics. So what the evolution professor is revealing there is his metaphysics. So he's right in line with his metaphysics. There's no reason to deny the obvious evidence that Arlen Stoltzfus talks about, and others who are willing to engage, willing to drop the metaphysics. Why would you say that? Why would you say we never observed that? Why would you deny that? Look at the flax experiments. I think what you could say, I won't try and put words in his mouth, but what I can imagine that evolutionist saying is, you don't know that was adaptive. All you know is that mutation occurred. So it occurred in multiple individuals and occurred multiple experiments. Well, it was just luck. See, they always have an out. They can always say, "Oh, it was just an accident." Chance mutations, just luckily in these series of experiments that they ran in Oregon, they just luckily got these chance random mutations that were random with respect to need, and they just happened to be the same one over and over again. The creating that directly addressed the environmental threat. They helped with the environmental threat, but that's not adaptive. It was luck. So
now, would you say there's a lot of examples of this? Like you gave the flax one, you gave the bacteria one. Is there a lot of other examples that come to mind?
There are others. There's yeast. That yeast experiments have found results that don't fit natural selection or random mutation. It's not something I follow real closely, so I can't really say how many there are.
Yeah. Now, there's one, actually, this is one that me and Dr. Dan argued about. So I just want to ask you about it. And I mean, I don't expect you to have the answer off the top of your head, but when like we were talking about lactose tolerance versus intolerance.
Yeah, that was a famous one.
Okay.
That was an early hint.
Okay, so you think that, because our argument about it was about whether, like I said, I don't think this counts as a random mutation because it's happened it's happened more than once. It's happened like they say, like 5 different times. And it seems to be a directed mutation in my mind. So, but do we know that so you said that was like an early hint that it might be?
Yeah, I would call it an early hint because, as I recall, and I haven't looked at it in a while, but as I recall, it wasn't, I think maybe there was a spectrum of mutations that happened. And so some of them hit the mark and others didn't, something like that. So you leave an opening for evolutionists to say, it just simply it identified a genomic area, a loci in the genome that got more mutations, and one of them got lucky. It wasn't, it didn't engineer a specific mutation. I think that might be the explanation. I'm not positive, but I do agree with you that so what? I mean, even if it did not create only a single mutation that solved the problem, if it was, a smattering of mutations, but they were directed in the right location, you start to get into these kind of legalism arguments that evolutionists want to try. They're into theory protectionism. And so the theory is true for evolutionists. And so when it is true, it cannot be false. There cannot be a problem. So every single empirical problem, of which there are, hundreds and thousands, you come up with, what's the best explanation? What can I say to deflect this? And so, the lactose experiments were very interesting, and they're totally legitimate, and they indicate something's going on. Were they ironclad? Probably not, but there's certainly, chalk, put that in the column of, interesting ones on the side of, yes, there is some sort of adaptive mechanism going on that utterly violates the prediction that was made. What they're doing is they're adjusting to the falsification. Okay, there was falsification, something that clearly falsified what my forefathers declared as absolute. Now I'm going to change. I'm going to do a dodge and weave and say, well, that one didn't quite do it because of these reasons. So that's why the history of these predictions is important. It's important to have a track record, have a tally, to have an accounting, so that, because if you just look at the current state, the evolutionists will say, no, there's no false predictions. Everything we've explained everything, but the explanations entail serendipity and complexity and impossible things, like things that are not selected for and so forth. So it's you look at the propensity of the evidence, and it's overwhelming that this is a falsified hypothesis, falsified prediction. And I like the evolution professor says, no, there was no such thing. We've never observed an adaptive mutation. It's like, wonderful, love it. That just, it just shows the state of denialism.
Now, I'm just going to put up some other, and there's more comments from Dr. Dan, and I'll put those up in a little bit, but let me hear from some other people here. Robert asks, so does that mean divine intervention is happening every time a beneficial adaptation is fixed in a population?
So what it means is that a prediction of evolution, an unequivocal, no question about it, fundamental prediction of evolution, was falsified, and the outcome, the response to it, was not good. We didn't gain new knowledge or anything. It was simply theory protectionism. That's what it means. Now, you want to get into a discussion of, what does that mean in terms of theology? What does that mean in terms of divine action? That's a whole nother discussion. I don't know. I mean, ask God. Why are you asking me? How would I know? I could say that there's an adaptive system in the cell that is doing that. And so does that mean there's divine intervention or not? It is a very complicated theological question. If something happens, if a leaf drops from the tree, was that divinely intended? Did God do that? Or did that happen via a law that God enacted and then he looked the other way and is not involved in it? This is very complicated. Theologians discuss this stuff. That's not my thing. I'm a scientist. I'm looking at the theory of evolution and its failures and the theological impact of it. But you want to talk about divine intervention, this is a very complicated subject. So I don't have a strong answer, but I would just say that from my perspective, there are intelligent adaptation mechanisms in biology that work, and they happen all the time. And there's tons of examples of intelligent adaptation that species go by. A lot of them are epigenetic. Some of them are actual mutations in the genome. And so those things that work. And how you want to characterize those theologically, that's, have at it.
So let's see. Okay. Solera Knight says mutations are random errors in DNA replication that introduce new genetic variations. These changes can be small, like a single nucleotide change, or larger. I just put that up in case you wanted to comment on it.
Yeah, so that's kind of the standard explanation of what they are, and with the added gloss that they are random. So that's a gloss. So everything she says there are kind of factual, empirical statements, except that random part. They're random errors. So why do we believe they are random errors? So this gets back to, why is this a prediction of evolution? Why is this so fundamental? Why did all the leading evolutionists mandate this? Why did Jacques Monod say that, have that incredible statement that he made? It doesn't come out of the theory. There's nothing in the theory of evolution that requires them to be random. And there's nothing in our empirical evidence that shows that they are random. I mean, I shouldn't say, put it more complicated. There do appear to be mutations that are just occurring. They're just randomly occurring. But then when you apply stress to a population, it appears that you can have mutations that directly address that threat. So mutations are all over the map. Yeah, there are some that appear to be random. Yes, but to say that mutations are random errors, period, uncategorically, that's the way they are. No, that's not an empirical statement.
Now, Frank says this is an excellent exposition of the third false prediction in Hunter's paper, which describes 23 false predictions. That paper is very detailed with references. See the link in the description. Yes, I have put Dr. Hunter's link in the description of this video, and so for that paper, and it's really great. You can go through and look at that. And we plan on doing more of evolution's false predictions in the future. So, stick with us on that. Thanks, Frank.
Yeah, thank you, Frank. Appreciate that. And it really is one way to evaluate a theory. There are many, many ways to evaluate scientific theories. There's no winner. There's no right answer to that question. There's just many ways to evaluate theories. One kind of obvious way to evaluate theories is to look at their predictions. What predictions did they make? A false prediction doesn't mean the theory is false. We talked about the astronomy example, discovering a new planet. You got a false prediction. The theory was fine. They didn't know about this other planet. So false predictions are not necessarily a bad thing, but they can be a bad thing depending on the outcome. What was the response? What was the denouement? What happened? And if you had new knowledge discovery, then it's a good thing. But if you have more complexity, if you have theory protectionism, if you have contradictory explanations and contradicting with other elements of the theory, that's a bad thing. And that's what we see over and over and over again. So not only do we have some fundamental predictions being falsified, we have a lot of fundamental predictions being falsified. And we have the outcomes on these false predictions not being good. It's not a pretty picture. Over and over and over again, we see complexity, serendipity, and conflicting explanations, that sort of thing, and theory protectionism. We don't see knowledge discovery. Very, very rarely do I ever see knowledge discovery.
Now, Dr. Dan says we have direct experiments that show mutations are random. Now, I don't think you were saying that we don't have random mutations. We do have random mutations, right? It's just most of the time, 99% of the time, they're harmful or deleterious.
Well, let's be a little more careful. I would say 99% of the time they are neutral or deleterious.
Okay.
So it's kind of a debate on the distribution on the fitness scale versus neutral and deleterious, but very rarely are they positive. And so,
yeah, and I should qualify it according to Dr. Dan, because he wrote a paper on this where he said 99% of mutations are deleterious. So, maybe it's not for everybody.
Okay, the evolution professor said it. So, he's not a neutral guy. So there's a debate within evolutionary theory on this, and that's fine. But to say, as the evolution professor here, is we have direct experiments that show mutations are random. So if you do not stress a population, if you are doing an experiment where it's like the environment is not altered and you're simply monitoring the mutations that occur, then yeah, they're not going to be adaptive. They're going to be random with respect to need. There isn't you're not activating the intelligent adaptation systems in the cell. But to deny that those are activated, that they do exist, and that they are activated when you have a stressful situation is simply a theory protectionism. It's not engaging, it's not reckoning with the science. And that's unfortunately the problem. That was the denialism step that I talked about.
This might be slightly off topic, but he says bit behind on but this ERV stuff, the insertions are stochastic and almost none have been co-opted.
Okay. That's a different subject. Yeah. It's I just, by the way, did a video yesterday on the following up on the herbs. So you can see that on my channel.
Yeah. Okay. So leave that for another day. Reclaimer 77 says, I don't think you should get to propose an all-powerful cause and then refuse to answer the why an intelligent entity would do so. I'm sorry, that's just weak tea. He shouldn't get away with that.
Love it. A great comment. Thank you. So I didn't propose an all-powerful cause to begin with, so it's a false premise, right? So yeah, I'm not shying away from something that I proposed. What I proposed is that we have false predictions. That we have a theory of evolution. It's a public theory. It's a scientific. It claims to be a scientific theory, and claims are made, and those claims can be tested. And what I'm doing is testing those claims. So that's it. I didn't propose an all-powerful cause.
Right.
I'm not. It's a whole nother topic. If somebody wants to talk about, well, what do you think about how God works? So, we all have opinions. I'm happy to get into a dorm room discussion of how God works and everything, but that's just a totally different subject. What we're talking about here is the theory of evolution. It needs scientific theories. Must be okay. It has to be okay to evaluate scientific theories. If it's not okay to evaluate scientific theories, then we got a big problem. It must not have been a scientific theory. So what this really is protectionism. It's like, let's get the light off of the theory and talk about something else. So let's talk about your religion. Like, okay, this has nothing to do with what we're talking about. So science is very important. We need to talk about science, and we need to, if somebody is going to insist that they have a scientific theory and that their scientific theory is true, it's a fact, and if you deny it, you are an idiot or you have other considerations at work, they're making claims that it's fair to address those claims. And we need to be able to address those claims and test those claims. Are you really, if you're doubting the idea that the world arose by itself, which is what evolution says, the world arose spontaneously by itself, by chance factors, which is absurd on many, many levels. It is the most absurd mythology I could imagine, actually. I think we've topped all the myths in history with this one, but that is our myth today. And if we're not allowed to test that and talk about how it fails, and fails dramatically, it fails hard, real hard. And we need to be able to discuss that without being chastised for not talking about some other subject.
Yeah, it's amazing to me how many times in these conversations it turns around to why would God do it this way? So
Right.
Because when we're just trying to examine the scientific evidence for evolution, why is it that it always keeps turning to God?
Because that's what it's all about. This is all about God. I ended my first book, Darwin's God, the last sentence, concluding, it's because this is not about science. It's about God. So the theory of evolution and Epicureanism and all that stuff, it's all about God.
And we're not running from talking about those things about God. But in these conversations that we're having about evolution, we want to talk about the science. We want to show you why the science is against evolution.
Well, adding to that, Rebekah, typically, I would say always, universally, whenever someone makes a comment like that, when everyone says, well, what about God? What are you saying, about God? When they're shifting the topic to theology, universally, they will not acknowledge the scientific problems with evolution. They do not acknowledge the absurdities of evolutionary theory. They do not acknowledge the hard failures. And so I can't have an intelligent discussion with someone who is in denial of the emperor's new clothes, someone who won't acknowledge a hard failure, because that shows you have other cards that you're not showing, and you just want to get into an argument about this. You first have to get kind of 2 + 2 = 4 cleared up, and we all have to be on the same page. If we can't have an intelligent discussion about something that we should be able to have an intelligent discussion on, that is science, the universal language, we should all be able to agree on, here's experiments, here's theories, here's how things line up, here's failures, here's successes. This is all, it should be non-controversial. This should be utterly non-controversial. But instead we see theory protectionism and wanting to debate something else. It's always theory protectionism at work when people say that they're not. Yeah, you're right. That's a good point. This theory has failed badly. Hey, now let's talk about something else. Let's talk about a replacement or something. Let's talk about this or that. Fine, let's have that discussion. But it doesn't work that way.
Yeah. How are we doing on time? Are you open to more comments, or do we need to close it down?
Getting close. I mean, are there some good ones as a question?
Well, I was going to bring up just a few more of Dr. Dan's, because he said the increase in mutation rate under stress is the opposite of what he says. You can pick if you can pick specific mutations, you don't need to mutate faster.
Yeah. So I agree. Yeah. If you can, you don't need to. So, but I'm just going by biology. The fact is you have both. So there are cases where there are specific mutations that are repeatable in multiple individuals. There are also cases where you have hypermutators and you have increased mutation rates, and that happens. So there's biology is all over the map. There's no one way that it works. If you can direct mutations, you don't need to increase the rate. Hey, talk to how this. I didn't design it. Okay, don't. I'm not the one who created this. So.
Right.
I'm just going by the facts. Okay, I'm going by empirical science. There are increases in mutation rates, and there are directed mutations. It's just the way it goes.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that's good. There are some more comments, but I think you've addressed most of the ideas already. So I don't know if there's anything new to add to it. So thank you so much. This has been an awesome presentation, and I do recommend people read Dr. Hunter's books and his paper on the false predictions of evolution. So thank you so much. And so my favorite book that you wrote is Science's Blind Spot. And what was it? What was the Darwin's one about? I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of it.
It was
Darwin's God. Darwin's God. That's also really good. So I highly recommend those books. And thank you so much. Did you have any final thoughts?
No, that's it. Except to thank you, Rebekah. Great podcast this morning. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks everybody for being here. Appreciate your support, and have a great day.